In this short video, I'm going to show you how you can use the ePrep to create a sequential processing workflow. A sequential workflow describes a process where all the tasks completed by the ePrep workstation are completed for a single sample before going on to a second sample. I'll take you through the tablet software and set up each of the tasks which will define the workflow, and then finally we will see the ePrep execute this workflow. It should be noted, however, that sequential processing is normally slower than batch processing in terms of the time taken to complete the whole sample set. This is because it typically requires tool changing and syringe washing between the tasks. But for some applications, sequential processing may be required for reasons of sample instability or post-sample processing, where a single sample needs to be completed before going on to a second sample. So for example, you might have a situation where you need to analyse your samples quickly and get each vial to the autosampler as soon as possible. In this case, sequential work processing would work better because the first sample is prepared completely before going on to the next sample. As soon as the first sample is prepared, it can go straight to the autosampler for analysis. So let us get started and set up a sequential process through the tablet software and see this workflow in action. So we will start by creating a new workflow. The sequential workflow can also be called a single task group workflow. And in this workflow, the first thing to do is we will add a diluent to the vial so the needle can be dipped in the liquid to ensure complete syringe droplet removal for subsequent additions. After that, we'll add the sample to the vial and choose aliquot sample. The next step will be to add an internal standard to the workflow. So we'll add this task. And this will be followed by adding a surrogate standard. Finally, we will make our solution up to volume. You will notice at this point that the tasks are labelled 1A, 1B, 1C, etc., rather than 1, 2, 3, to show that they are all part of a sequential group. We will now start filling out the tasks by choosing the appropriate syringes and nominating the volumes we want to use. For the first task, add diluent, we are going to add 500 microliters of diluent, so we will use a 1 ml or a 1000 microliter syringe. So we enter the diluent amount of 500 microliters, and you can see that that appears as part of the first task. So for the next task, we will add our sample, and we'll add 100 microliters, so we will use a 100 microliter syringe, and then aliquot 100 microliters of sample. Next, we will add our internal standard, so we will use a 100 microliter syringe, and then enter the amount of 75 microliters. For the surrogates, we add 50 microliters, so we will use a 100 microliter syringe and enter the amount of 50 into the software. I'm sure by now you are starting to get the flow of doing this. And finally, for the last task, we will make up the volume to 1 ml, and we will choose a 1000 microliter syringe for this, and then nominate the final volume. Note that we don't have to nominate the actual makeup volume amount, as the software will calculate this amount for us. So to recap at this point, all of our tasks have been chosen and the syringes required selected, and the volume of liquid has been associated with each of the tasks. You will perhaps notice that the color tag associated with each task is red, telling us that we haven't fully completed the workflow and there is a conflict somewhere. We could check the errors by clicking on the error button, but for now, we will continue with the workflow. So the next step is to choose containers for all the input files, such as the diluent, samples, internal standards, and surrogates, and to choose the output containers where the sample and reagents are added. We start this process by firstly setting up the deck by selecting the diluent tubes. To set the deck up, we select Configure Racks. And in this workflow, we are only going to use 3 racks. One to contain the diluent, one rack to contain the samples and the internal standard solution, and the surrogate solution, and the third rack will contain the output tubes for our finally prepared solutions. So we will select the solvent rack in position number 2. Then we'll grab the Ballack rack and put this in position 5 for our samples, internal standards, and surrogates. The Ballack rack can house 24 large vials and is used quite a lot. And finally, we will add the waters rack to position 9. You can see how easy, through the drag and drop feature, it is to select racks and add them to the deck. Our racks are now in place and will accept those changes. The next part of the process is to nominate the actual containers to be used and the starting volume, if that is applicable. The first dispense is diluent, and for this we use reagent jars. In this workflow and in each of the jars, the starting volume will be 50 mils of diluent. When we accept these changes, you can see that these jars are associated with the first task as the input vials. This connection of the input containers with the task occurred because we started this container process by firstly selecting the input tubes for the add diluent task. We will continue this process by next selecting our sample tubes by clicking on Select Sample Tubes. Our sample tubes will be placed in the Ballack rack in the first 5 positions, so we'll choose Start at 1 and End at 5, and then accept those changes, and you can see now that these appear associated with the aliquot sample task as Group 2. Next, we'll select our internal standard tube, and this will be located in the middle rack in this position. So we click at that location, then select that position to both start and end at. We will have 25 mils of internal standard, so we entered this amount in the software. And then that appears as Group 3 associated with the internal standard task. So we'll choose the surrogate standard tube, and this will be at this position, which is position 15 in the rack. And this standard tube will have 25 mils of solution. And then we accept the changes. Finally, we will select the diluent container from Group 1 for the makeup to volume task. At this stage of the process, all the input tubes have been defined, so now we have to define the output tubes. For this workflow, the output tubes will be 2 ml vials located here in these waters racks, and we'll select the first 5 vials for the output tubes. Now that the workflow has been completed, we have green tags on each of the tasks, and this shows there are no conflicts and all the syringes match the volumes required. It also shows there is enough volume in each of the containers to carry out the workflow, and that all the input and output containers have been defined. We will save this workflow and give it a name of Single Task Group Workflow. and select Save. We're now ready to run, so we'll choose Run, and you will see that the deck is displayed, showing each of the racks with the allocated containers. Once you have checked all the syringes are in place and the containers are all set, we can now start the workflow by choosing Press to confirm and Continue. We can now see the ePrep in operation. In this video, we shall skip the syringe washing and syringe changes, as this would take too long to view, but these will be executed nonetheless as part of this workflow. We pick up the workflow after vials 1 and 2 have been completely finished with all components added. Also, the diluent has already been added to vial 3. The ePrep is now executing the second task, which is the addition of 100 microliters of the sample to vial 3. The third task is the syringe aliquots 75 microliters of internal standard into the same vial. The fourth task is the syringe aliquots 50 microliters of surrogate solution into vial 3. And then the last task in the workflow for vial 3 is the solution is made up to 1 ml volume. So vial 3 is now finished and ready for analysis, and the ePrep continues to do its job for vials 4 and 5.